Our guest is Greg Mitchell. He writes the Media Fix blog for thenation.com. He's author of numerous books. His latest is Atomic Cover-Up, 2 U.S. soldiers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the greatest movie never made. Welcome. You have been covering this for decades. The significance, Greg, of this day, August 9th, 66 years ago, and what it means today in nuclear-ravaged Japan.
Right. Well, of course, it's particularly poignant given the Fukushima nuclear disaster and the similarly to after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fears of so many people that they've been tainted by released radiation, and so the psychological effects of the nuclear disaster are severe. And in fact, survivors of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been campaigning this year against nuclear power, which is something they haven't particularly done in the past, linking nuclear weapons and nuclear power, the fear of radiation, the chance of catastrophe, the chance of disaster. So it's a special day for that. And of course, the other reason is because, as I've pointed out for many years, the U.S. is the only country that has used the bomb twice in war, as you mentioned. And, you know, it may surprise many people to know we still have a first-use policy in the United States. And the lesson that has been handed down to us for decades now is that, yes, never again, we should never use nuclear weapons again. However, we continue, most Americans, certainly American leaders, American policymakers, American media, all defend the use of the bomb, or the double use of the bomb back in 1945. So the message is these weapons are too dangerous to use, but we used them before, we continue to defend it, we continue to have a first strike policy. So to me, that's a very dangerous lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Talk about the color videotape of the atomic bombing that has rarely been shown, and yet it's been around, well, since right after the bombing.
Right. Well, that's basically what my new book is about. It's about the suppression of this footage, both the American footage, which was in color and was shot by the U.S. military, and the Japanese footage, which was shot by the Japanese newsreel team and is in black and white. In fact, in your first part of this program, almost all the images that people saw on the screen was black and white footage. Even to this day, not many people have seen much of the color footage, and that's because the U.S. suppressed that color footage shot by our own military for decades. And it really wasn't until the 1980s that any of it came out. Snippets have been used in film, you know, so we see a little bit more of it now. But in this key moment in our nuclear history, as nuclear power was becoming entrenched, as nuclear arms race continued for decades, Americans were not exposed to the full truth of the bomb. Interestingly,
the scientists at Los Alamos who made the bomb, most of them thinking that it would be used, if need be, on Germany, actually were privately shown this video, weren't they? Yeah, and so the
video was taken by the Pentagon, and parts of it were made into training films to show, you know, show our policymakers and our military what the bomb could do. What my book focuses on is 2 U.S. military officers who shot the footage and then for decades after tried to get it released, tried to get it shown on TV, tried to get it made into a movie to be shown in theaters. Daniel McGovern and Herbert Susan. And they tried for decades to get it released and shown to a wider public, and it really didn't happen until, you know, just a few years ago.
Talk about the YouTube video that you just didn't think was particularly controversial. It was a kind of promo for your book, illustrating your point.
Yeah, well, if people search for it on YouTube under Atomic Cover-Up, they'll find it. It's just a 2-minute video, and it includes some of the suppressed footage. And I think that's why, after I loaded it on YouTube, I got a notice from Google that they were not going to allow any ads for it because it showed, because of the promoted violence, as they said, which was, of course, 180 degrees from what it really did. It's sort of against violence and against war. And of course, the real irony was that it was an act of suppression about a book and a video that is about suppression. So there were a lot of people protested, and that sort of ended it after a few days.
Well, speaking of the stories that were told, about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wanted to go to Wilfred Burchett, the first journalist to make it into Hiroshima, which was bombed 3 days before Nagasaki. It was bombed August 6, 1945, an Australian reporter who defied the U.S. military ban, who took a train for 30 hours. The whole area of southern Japan was off limits. He took this train to Hiroshima. In this recording, an excerpt from the documentary of Andrew Phillips called Hiroshima Countdown, Burchett describes what he saw.
I went to a hospital which had survived in the outskirts of the city. These people were all in various states of physical disintegration. They would all die, but they were giving them whatever comfort could be given until they died. And the doctor explained that he didn't know why they were dying. The only symptoms they could isolate from a medical point of view was that of acute vitamin deficiency. So they started giving vitamin injections. And he explained that where they put the needle in, then the flesh started to rot. And then gradually the thing would develop this bleeding, which they couldn't stop, and then the hair falling out. And the hair falling out was more or less the last stage, and a number of the women who were lying there with sort of halos of their black hair, which had already fallen out. I felt staggered, really staggered by what I had seen. And just where I sat down, I found some lump of concrete, I remember, that had not been pulverized. I sat on that with my little Hermes typewriter. And my first words, I remember now, were, I write this as a warning to the world.
I write this as a warning to the world, Wilfred Burchett wrote, his reporting exposing the horrors of the bombings and particularly talking about, well, he didn't have the words for radiation. He talked about an atomic plague. The New York Times correspondent told a very different story. The reporter William Lawrence was not just working for the Times, though. He was also on the payroll of the U.S. War Department. That's what the Pentagon was called at the time. Lawrence wrote military press releases and statements for President Harry Truman and Secretary of War Stimson, all the while faithfully parroting the line of the U.S. government in the pages of the New York Times. He was awarded the 1946 Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Nagasaki, as well as on the U.S. government's development of the atomic bomb. His work was crucial in launching a half-century of silence about the deadly, lingering effects of the bomb. In 2005, I joined my brother, the journalist David Goodman, to call on the Pulitzer board to strip Lawrence of, and the New York Times of the Pulitzer for their atomic bomb reporting. Juan Gonzalez and I talked to David on Democracy Now! About William Lawrence's deception.
William Lawrence had immigrated to the United States from Lithuania in the 1930s, at a time when actually the New York Times was laying off reporters due to the Great Depression. They asked Lawrence to become both the newspaper's and the nation's first dedicated science reporter. Lawrence became fascinated with atomic power and atomic weapons, and was an ardent supporter of atomic power in the articles that he wrote throughout the 1930s and into the early 1940s. This is probably what caught the attention of the War Department. In the spring of 1945, a remarkable meeting took place secretly at the headquarters of the New York Times in Times Square in New York City. General Leslie Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, which was the name of the program that was developing atomic bombs for the U.S. military, came to Times Square, to the New York Times, and met secretly with Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, and William Lawrence. At that meeting, he asked Lawrence if he would become a paid publicist, essentially, for the Manhattan Project. So while simultaneously working as a newspaper reporter for the New York Times, he would also be writing, essentially, propaganda for the War Department. Officially, he was asked to put in layman's terms the benefits of atomic weapons and the development of atomic power. Other New York Times reporters were unaware of this arrangement, this dual arrangement where he was being paid by both the government and the newspaper, and in fact were somewhat mystified when Lawrence began taking long leaves of absence. Well, the government's investment in Lawrence paid off in spades because he was rewarded for his loyalty. He was also ended up writing statements for Secretary of War Stimson and for President Truman himself. He was rewarded by being given a seat in the squadron of planes that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. I'll read to you a little excerpt of Lawrence's dispatch. In general, his writing, well, these days journalists would call it purple prose, but it was often imbued with these messianic themes about the potential and power of atomic weapons. Here is what he had to say in describing the bombing of Nagasaki. This bombing is thought to have taken about 70,000 to 100,000 lives. Lawrence recounted, quote, being close to it and watching it as it was being fashioned, he's speaking here of the atomic bomb, into a living thing so exquisitely shaped that any sculptor would be proud to have created it. One felt oneself in the presence of the supernatural. Now, Lawrence went on to write a series of 10 articles about the development of the atomic bomb. This and his reporting about the Nagasaki bombing won him the 1946 Pulitzer Prize in reporting. He seems to have been completely unashamed and unrepentant of what was clearly an egregious conflict of interest by any of the most basic canons of journalism ethics. Lawrence later wrote in his memoirs about his experience as a paid publicist for the War Department. He wrote, quote, mine has been the honor, unique in the history of journalism, of preparing the War Department's official press release for worldwide distribution. No greater honor could have come to any newspaperman or anyone else for that matter.
And David, I think it's instructive, the effects of this reporting. I mean, on the one hand, you had someone like Wilfred Burchett on the ground talking about, he didn't even have the words to describe. He talked about bomb sickness. He talked about atomic plague. And then you have Lawrence's front page story, September 12th, 1945, U.S. atom bomb site belies Tokyo tales. Tests on New Mexico range confirmed that blast and not radiation took toll. This after William Lawrence, while he didn't go to Hiroshima, was taken by Leslie Groves, the general in charge of the Manhattan Project that was responsible for the bomb, took Lawrence and other reporters to New Mexico to counter what the War Department, what Groves was calling Japanese propaganda of the effects, the deadly effects of radiation.
And in fact, Lawrence knew better, because having observed the Trinity test, the first explosion of the atomic bomb in the deserts of New Mexico, he knew that Geiger counters had spiked around the area of the bombing long after the actual bomb itself. In fact, an interesting footnote to this whole encounter is that when Lawrence was brought by Groves in this effort, as Amy describes.
We're going to pull out of that clip of David Goodman describing William Lawrence. William Lawrence, Greg Mitchell, the original embedded reporter, won a Pulitzer Prize for his reports, was also on the payroll of the War Department, writing the Stimson press releases and statements.
Right. Well, it was, I mean, he's a symbol, I guess, but really it was, we had decades of this suppression. You know, my book talks about the film footage, which was extremely significant, but of course in the media and in official statements by the government, there was basically a Hiroshima narrative. And it was important that it get established early and then it be maintained because of the arms race. We wanted to build a hydrogen bomb, which we did a few years later. And so it's been important to the development both of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy in the U.S. that this Hiroshima narrative be disseminated. And, you know, really from the first words of the nuclear age, it was a lie when Truman said that they bombed Hiroshima, which was merely a military base. And so it's been 66 years of that kind of misstatements and misleading arguments.
The words nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and suppression of information follow through right to today, and this is where we're going to end, as the Japanese people deal with their government in the last few days, hearing that the radiation levels are highest than they've ever been since the nuclear meltdowns.
Right. Yeah, that's it's continuing today, certainly in Japan, and one fears it would happen in the U.S. as well if we had a nuclear crisis here. So it seems like anything that the nuclear weapons or the nuclear energy touches leads to suppression and leads to danger for the public.